Another approach that some people have tried is the idea of measuring legislation. So, for example, the World Bank has a good data set on public accountability mechanisms. They publish country data on financial disclosure, freedom of information, conflict of interest for some countries. Similarly, the Europam dataset, you can see it at europam.eu, publishes similar data, but for the 35 countries that I mentioned, 35 European countries which I mentioned before, so 34 countries plus the European Commission, and also use data on political financing, financial disclosure, conflict of interests, freedom of information, and public procurement. So basically what both of these datasets do, they measure the comprehensiveness of national regulations in these 5 areas, or rather these 3 areas when we're talking about the World Bank PAM. What is to be said about this is definitely an interesting approach and a worthwhile approach. But because it's taking stock of the legislation, it really tells us about how well a certain area is regulated. But of course, it's not a measure of corruption, and it also doesn't aim to be. Because in the end, the existence of legislation really doesn't say anything about this type of legislation is implemented. It tells you that a certain legal framework exists, which can be good and can be useful in certain contexts, but it doesn't say anything about actually how much corruption there is in a country. These type of indicators can help you, though, for some secondary analysis. So how does the existence of a certain legal framework or of certain legal provisions influence the control of corruption? Or rather, it can tell you how effective are certain legislative measures in controlling corruption. However, measuring public integrity frameworks is quite popular generally, and also is an interesting approach to the question of corruption measurement. One project to highlight is the Global Integrity Report, which really aims at assessing the implementation of laws and institutions to provide public integrity. So that again is an expert assessment that looks at both the existence of institutions and practices, and also the implementation of laws. So not only the existence of laws, but also are these actually applied in practice. The sort of difficult thing about the Global Integrity Report is that it is published fairly irregularly and covers, in the last edition at least, only 33 countries. For these countries, they provide good data, and it's an interesting measure, but it's a bit tricky to work with it. The last index which I want to highlight is the Index of Public Integrity, which was published in 2015 and 2017 by the European Research Center for Anti-Corruption and State Building at the Hertie School of Governance. It was developed by Alina Munjapipidi, who we already have heard in the first lecture of this series, and it's an effort to use objective data to assess public integrity frameworks and the ability of a society to control corruption. So what the IPI does, it uses 3 indicators that measure constraints on corruption, so e-citizenship, freedom of the press, judicial independence, and 3 further indicators which look at resources for corruption, so the administrative burden, budget transparency, and trade openness. It is based basically on objective data, except for judicial independence and press freedom, which are based on expert scores, but otherwise is built in a way to make tracking change possible. So the idea is really that if you look at the IPI, you can see if the public integrity framework of a country over the years has improved or decreased. Because it's only available for 2 years so far, tracking change is not that rich yet, but it's a very interesting approach. Quite interesting because it's founded in anti-corruption theory, so it really takes years of work in anti-corruption into account, and also uses quantitative analysis using other corruption indices in order to check if the indicators that they include actually are useful indicators to assess the presence of corruption or the absence of corruption. Just a quick snapshot, as you will see, like the countries which are included in the top places in the IPI are fairly similar to the CPI or the World Bank score that we discussed in the beginning. But in the end, the aim of the IPI is not to replace those scores, but rather to provide a score that helps you to track change over time in these different indicators. So, while again, this is not a measure for corruption per se, but rather for integrity frameworks, it's an interesting approach and it's worthwhile to explore. So just to summarize this lecture, and one point which I really try to get across here is that measuring corruption is hard, but there are many different ways to do it. Objective measures are always the better option to go for. But in this context, data availability remains an issue. Other indicators like expert indices and survey-based indicators really have their merit. They can provide you with good ways to measure corruption, but you have to be aware of the shortcomings. And also, when you look at previous research, and if you look at already existing research on corruption and on the control of corruption, be aware of what indicator they use and what inference they derive from these indicators. When you look at corruption measurement, you really have to think clearly about what you want to measure. Do you want to measure petty corruption, so day-to-day bribery, grand corruption or administrative corruption? Define your concept and decide on the measurement that you use in order to measure this concept. If you're looking for a concept and there's no existing measure that you can find that really fits your concept, you can maybe create your own measurement as well for measuring corruption or for measuring a certain corruption concept. But we'll talk more about collecting your own data and creating your own corruption measure in one of the later lectures. What I really wanted to get across is that choosing the right measurement is an important part of your research design, and that being able to understand the measure that is used in a certain context is important in order to understand the entire thought behind a research paper. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture.